Well, it's definitely not summer anymore where I live. If you've been around for a while, you might remember this piece that I made back in the spring after a short road trip over to Vancouver Island. Well, I've decided that it's time to make an autumn version of that piece. The other day, we headed out of the city to a small village not too far away from where I live that my daughter said has very autumnal vibes. And I'm going to take inspiration from this display that we saw in Fort Langley and create a stitched version of this. Not an exact recreation, but just something inspired by it. I'm going to start by creating the background for the piece, and I've already gathered up a dark green piece of cloth that I've cut to size, and I've got some little bits of blue fabric here too that I'm going to use to create the ground or the table that my objects are going to sit on. When I create a scene, I like to start out by establishing what's called a horizon line in artwork, and that is a horizontal line that cuts your surface in two, and everything below that horizon line is either the table or the floor or the whatever the spaces that things are going to sit on. So that's what I'm doing right now with these light blue pieces of cloth, which I think show up really nicely against the dark green background, which will represent the back wall or the sky or something in the background. I'm just stitching all of these little bits of fabric down using just a running stitch, and I'm not being too careful about it because, as I said, lots of this is going to get covered up with many, many, many layers. And my second layer, after I've got the ground stitch down, is to add some pots and some pumpkins. So my plant pots are just going to be a really simple shape, and because they're round, I'm going to curve the top and the bottom, but you don't really have to. You can just cut out a rectangular shape, and I'm not going to be too particular about the shapes. I'm just going to use whatever I can from these little scraps of cloth that I have left over from other projects. And I've chosen some black fabric because some of the pots in my inspiration piece were black. The patterns and the little designs on the pots just add a little bit of extra texture. And you'll notice that I'm placing the pots quite low down. I want to make sure that I leave lots of room to add lots of beautiful flowers. And one thing that I'm making sure is I'm not putting them on the edge of that horizon line or way up near the top so they look like they're in the sky. And there, magically, I've got 3 pots sewn down, and I've gathered up some orangey color fabrics to start cutting out my pumpkins. Now, pumpkins are really easy. They're just random blob shapes. They don't have to be very particular. Some of them are small, some of them are bigger, some of them are wide. And I don't use templates or anything like that. So for the pots or for my pumpkins, because I'd like each of them to have their own distinct shape and personality, and I don't want them to be the same, because just as in life, no two pumpkins would be exactly the same. I don't want my stitched pumpkins to be exactly the same. And another thing you'll notice that I did there is that I overlapped one of the pumpkins with a pot. Now, overlapping things is another way to create layers and depth. But one thing to watch out for is the things that are behind are partially hidden by the things that are in front. But the things that are in front are lower down on your surface. If you put something behind lower down, then it looks like the other piece is sort of floating. So keep in mind that the further back things are, the higher up they are on your surface. So you'll see with my pumpkin that I'm stitching on here, because it's slightly lower down, it reads as being in front of the pot. And I'm just stitching around the edges of the piece so that the raw edges of my pumpkin all get stitched down. And this is the same thing that I did with the pots. In the pots I used black thread so it blended in. And for the pumpkin I'm using sort of a peachy color thread that kind of coordinates with the orange of the pumpkin, but it's a slight contrast. And I'll just go all the way around the pumpkin. And then after I've got the pumpkin stitched down, I'm going to create some little lines on top of the pumpkins that represent the sort of ridges or ribs that you see in a pumpkin. And I'm just going to stitch them with 1 or 2 threads. And these lines, I'm curving them slightly to suggest the roundness of the pumpkin. If I had sewn these lines on straight up and down, then it would look like a very flat pumpkin. And I'm doing this one with backstitch, so it creates more of a solid line. But you can certainly do it with other stitches like running stitch if you like. And just like all the pots are not the same, I'm not going to make all the pumpkins exactly the same color. So this one is going to be a slightly different shade of orange than the first one because, again, just like in nature, there's lots of varieties. And I'm thinking a little bit about where I want to place this one so that it looks like it's a little bit further back on the table than the other pumpkin that I did. And I'm going around it, just overcasting it in the same way, and I'll add those ridge lines as well. And after I've got my pots and my pumpkins laid down, I will start to add some more details. Now I've gathered up some bits of fabric that have small flowers on them, and I'm going to cut those out and add these to the top of my pots. So I could go in and just start stitching flowers right away, but I like to have some background texture there so that when I start stitching, I don't have to fill in as much. And these little flowers can take up some space and add some variety, and also will suggest some colors. You notice that the colors that I'm choosing here really do reflect the colors that were in the inspiration piece. I've cut out all sorts of little different flowers, and I'm layering them and stacking them together here. These are going to get largely covered up, so I'm not really worried too much about how this looks or having things be perfect. And here's how they look after I've filled all those pots with applique flowers. And now this next layer, it's my favorite part. It's where I get to add all kinds of fun little stitches. And I've already gone in and stitched that first one just using some really simple, straightforward stitches. There's really not a lot of complexity, and you can see what a difference those stitch flowers have added to that middle pot there. And I'm going to go in and do the same thing with the other two pots as well. I'm going to add lots of little stitches. First one that I'm doing in a light mauve color is called a lazy daisy stitch. It's like a series of chain stitches that all start from a center point and fan out in a circle to create a very daisy-like flower, hence the name. And I'm going to do a cluster of these all together, all in the same color, and I'm just going over top off the background fabric, so you'll still see some of the flowered fabric peeking through, but I'd like my stitching to be the main attraction rather than the pre-printed floral cloth that I've chosen here. I'm clustering my flowers close together so they all look like they're coming from the same plant. And I'll just keep going until I run out of thread with this mauvey purple thread. Once this thread is finished, I'll choose another color and start some more flowers. So now that I've finished with the purple thread, I've switched over to a pink thread, and this one is variegated thread, so it goes from a pale pink to a dark fuchsia, and I'm going to use a slightly different stitch here. These stitches are also going to radiate out around a central point, but instead of doing chain stitches, I'm just doing straight stitches. It can't really be much simpler than that. And I'm not being very precise at all. I'm just going around in a circle, and however many stitches there are to finish the circle, that's how it is. There is a slightly more organized version of this stitch that's sometimes called the Algerian eye stitch, and this is how it looks. Let me give you a look at this piece here. I've been working on this all year, and it's basically a sampler of many different stitches. But now let's go back to my little flowers here. And this is definitely my favorite part. Stitching away, adding stitches, not worrying too much about how they look because there are going to be so many stitches on this, and if I don't like something, I can add more stitches on top of it, and the bottom layer just becomes a little bit of background. There's really no right or wrong here because flowers are never perfect. So don't worry about it too much. Just carry on stitching. Carry on stitching. I don't know if you remember, but when I was a kid, there was a series of comedies called Carry On. So I don't know. Maybe this is a comedic stitching project. Again, I'm doing these stitches in a little cluster here up in the corner, and I'm making a point of sometimes just stitching over the edges of the flowery cloth that I have underneath to make sure that that's all stitched down well, and to also to make an interesting composition. So now I've finished off with my pink thread, so I've chosen another color, an orange thread this time, and I'm making French knots. And this is a perfect place to practice French knots because if they don't look perfect and they're a little bit scruffy, it does not matter. You again, I've mentioned it before. You can always sew on top, stitch other things on top, layer. You can even layer some bits of cloth on top. And I'm going to do a cluster of these French knots that look like teeny tiny little orange flowers. You could also do French knots for the centers of your flowers if you like. And I'm not really bothered about it. My flowers are small enough that I'm not really worrying about whether they have centers or not. Once I finish my French knots, I can add something else. And you'll notice how I'm varying the colors that I've used in these pieces. They all seem to go together, but I'm varying the colors that I use. I'm varying the amounts of the colors. Sometimes I've got a lot of purple, sometimes I've got a little bit of purple. So this is what my piece looks after I've done lots and lots and lots of flowery stitches. But I'm not done yet. So now I'm going to add some leaves into my composition because I am nothing if not a maximalist. So I've got some green thread here, and this is variegated green thread, which is kind of fun because I can get a variety of shades of green, but if I don't have variegated thread, I can just use shorter lengths of different colors of thread. And I'm going to scatter some leaves around my composition, and if there are any flowers that I don't particularly like, I can just layer a leaf over top. And you'll notice how the floral fabric that I used in the background, it's really not that noticeable anymore. You can see that those printed fabrics are really not the focus of my piece here. My stitching really becomes the focus with the fabrics just playing a supporting role in the background. So I'm just scattering these leaves across the piece, and you might notice that the two pots of flowers on the right have sort of merged together, so they're forming another connection, just like when I overlap the pot with the pumpkin, they're connected with each other. These two pots of flowers on this side are connected to each other, while the other one is on its own over on the other side. And maybe there's a story there, I don't know, but what do you think? Is there a reason why there's two pots of flowers together and one over on its side? I don't know. Just something. So, what do you think? Am I finished yet? No, not quite. Now, I did not forget to add stems to the pumpkins, so that's what I'm going to do next. I've got a couple of strands here of a beige color thread and one of a light yellow, just to add some variety so it's not all flat and monotonic, so that there's a little bit of variety there. And I'm doing what's called an open chain stitch. So it looks a little bit like a fly stitch, but instead of having one securing stitch at that end, I've got two that are spread a little bit further apart. It's a little bit wider than a regular chain stitch or a fly stitch. And once I've got that established, I'm going to fill it in with some more fly stitches, chain stitches, straight stitches, whatever it is, to fill it in. And I don't really have to be very particular. If there's little bits of the dark background showing through, that's not a big deal. It just adds some shadows and some variation to my piece. And I'm going to go ahead and add stems to all of my pumpkins there. And now let's have a look and see what it looks like now. But I'm not finished yet. I'm still going to add more stitching because this is all about autumn layers. So now what I'm doing last is I'm going to just add some stitches to the background cloth. I hadn't really secured those very carefully to my piece, so I'm just going to start adding some running stitches. So To secure the edges of those little scraps of cloth down, I'm not going to go over the foreground elements. I'm just going to go around the areas where you can see the blue cloth showing up. And I didn't do this at the beginning because, as you can see, lots of the blue areas have already been covered up. So I don't really need to add more stitches in those areas. I'm just going to add the stitches in the parts that are showing. My friend Penelope has mentioned this, that when you do this sort of stitching over scrappy layers of cloth, something quite magical happens, and at some point the composition goes from looking like individual pieces of cloth that have been sewn together to looking like a cohesive unit. And you can't always tell when it happens, but all of a sudden you look at it and you go, wow, that sure has changed. So, and there you go. I don't know, is it finished yet? Maybe, maybe not, but I'm going to stop this video for now. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope I've inspired you to make your own autumn composition. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye for now.